the soldier who opened a peace center. In the quiet pre-dawn hours, when most of the world still slumbered, a lone figure sat at the edge of his bed, heart pounding silently in his chest. His name was James Carter, a name as ordinary as any, but he would become a symbol of extraordinary transformation, a living testament to the power of redemption and the belief that one person can ignite a ripple of peace in a world too often marred by conflict. James had grown up in a small town in the Midwest, where the horizon seemed to stretch forever and the only sounds were the rustling of cornfields and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. His father had been a veteran, his grandfather before him, and so, when James turned 18, he felt the invisible hand of expectation guiding him to the local recruitment office. There, beneath the staccato hum of fluorescent lights, he signed his name and pledged himself to a cause he barely understood. The military was everything James had imagined and nothing like he expected. It was discipline, camaraderie, and purpose. But it was also fear, confusion, and a gnawing sense of being adrift. He was deployed overseas, to a region whose language and customs were as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. There, in the shadow of mountains and amidst the cries of families displaced by war, James encountered the brutal reality of conflict. At first, he wore his uniform like a suit of armor, believing that he was on the side of righteousness, that his actions, no matter how painful, would ultimately serve the greater good. But as the months dragged on, and the faces of the people he encountered began to haunt his dreams, James felt the certainty of his convictions erode. He saw children orphaned, villages destroyed, and the eyes of mothers who had lost everything. He wondered, with increasing desperation, whether peace could ever be achieved through the barrel of a gun. It was during one endless night, while his unit huddled in a makeshift shelter as mortar shells thundered in the distance, that James met Amir, a local interpreter whose courage seemed to defy reason. Amir was gentle, intelligent, and spoke often of a future where his country would be free from violence. He told James stories of his childhood, of playing in fields of wildflowers, and of the laughter that once filled his home. Through Amir's eyes, James began to see the people around him not as faceless enemies, but as kindred spirits, human beings caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control. One day, tragedy struck. A roadside bomb claimed Amir's life, shattering any illusion James had maintained about the nature of war. In the hours and days that followed, James was consumed by grief and guilt. He questioned everything he had ever believed. He wrote long letters home, pouring out his anguish, but the words felt hollow. He promised Amir, in a whispered vow beneath a foreign sky, that he would one day do something to honor his memory. He just didn't know what. When James finally returned home, he was a different man. He carried invisible scars, nightmares that jerked him awake, a constant tension in his shoulders, a sense of dislocation that made even the simplest joys feel unreachable. He tried to reintegrate, to find a job, to be present for his family and friends. But the world seemed colder, smaller, and he felt trapped by memories of things he could not change. One afternoon, while walking through his old neighborhood, James passed by the community center where he had once played basketball as a boy. It was boarded up now, windows shattered, graffiti scrawled across the doors. As he stood there, staring at the ruins of what had once been a place of laughter and belonging, an idea began to take shape, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build something new from the ashes of the past. James spent weeks researching, making calls, and meeting with city officials. He attended town hall meetings, sometimes speaking, sometimes just listening. At first, his idea was met with skepticism. A peace center? In a town that had lost its sense of unity? But James was persistent. He shared his story, told of his time in the military, of Amir, of the pain of loss and the longing for connection. Gradually, people began to listen. With the help of a small but dedicated group of volunteers, many of them veterans like himself, James set to work. They cleaned out the old community center, scrubbing away years of neglect. They painted walls, replaced windows, and built a garden in the overgrown lot behind the building. Donations trickled in: books, art supplies, musical instruments, and, most importantly, time. People from all walks of life began to contribute, each bringing their own gifts and stories. James named the place the Peace Center, in honor of Amir and all those whose voices had been silenced by violence. Its mission was simple: to be a sanctuary where people could come together, share their stories, and learn from one another. The doors were open to everyone: veterans, refugees, children, elders, those struggling with trauma, and those seeking connection. The grand opening was a modest affair, but to James, it felt monumental. He stood at the entrance, watching as people filed in. There was laughter, music, and the unmistakable sense that something important was happening. For the first time in years, James felt hope flicker inside him. The Peace Center quickly became a heartbeat in the community. Veterans who had once felt isolated found solace in the company of others who understood their pain. Immigrants and refugees, many of whom had fled violence in their own countries, discovered a place where they could share their culture and be embraced. Children painted murals on the walls, each stroke a testament to the possibility of a brighter future. James organized workshops on conflict resolution and nonviolent communication. He invited speakers from diverse backgrounds: educators, faith leaders, artists, and activists. There were storytelling nights, where people shared memories of home, of loss, of hope. There were meditation sessions, yoga classes, and support groups for those wrestling with anxiety and depression. Slowly, the wounds began to heal, not just for James, but for everyone who entered the center's doors. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, James found himself sitting in the garden behind the Peace Center. The air was filled with the mingled voices of people from every corner of the world, sharing food and laughter. For a moment, James closed his eyes and listened. He thought of Amir and all the others who had shown him that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of understanding, compassion, and community. The journey had not been easy. There were days when James doubted himself, when old memories threatened to overwhelm him. There were moments of conflict, differences of opinion, cultural misunderstandings, the lingering ache of grief. But each time, he reminded himself of the promise he had made, to honor the past by building a future rooted in peace. As the years passed, the Peace Center grew. Its influence spread beyond the town, inspiring others to create similar spaces in their own communities. James was invited to speak at conferences and schools, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. He always began the same way, not with tales of heroism, but with the simple truth that healing begins when we choose to see one another not as enemies, but as fellow travelers on the journey of life. One winter, a young woman named Lila approached James after a workshop. She had fled her war-torn homeland with nothing but a small suitcase and a photograph of her family. At first, she spoke little, her eyes downcast. But over time, she found her voice, sharing her story with the center's community. She told James that before coming to the Peace Center, she had lost faith in the possibility of kindness. Now, she said, she wanted to help others as she had been helped. James realized then that the greatest legacy of the Peace Center was not the building or the programs, but the way it empowered people to become agents of peace in their own lives. Each person who walked through its doors left carrying a spark of hope, a reminder that even in a world scarred by violence, there is always room for healing. One day, James received a letter from Amir's family. They had heard of the Peace Center and wanted to thank him for honoring Amir's memory. They wrote of their own journey through grief, of their longing for reconciliation, and of their belief that peace must be built, one relationship at a time. James wept as he read their words, feeling the circle of connection widen. As the seasons turned, the Peace Center continued to thrive. There were setbacks, of course, funding challenges, occasional vandalism, the ever-present struggle to meet the needs of a diverse and growing community. But each time, James and his team met adversity with resilience and creativity. They held fundraisers, wrote grant proposals, and reached out to new partners. The community rallied, refusing to let a dream die. The center became a model for others, a place where differences were not merely tolerated, but celebrated. Where wounds were acknowledged and tended, rather than ignored. Where children learned that empathy is a strength, not a weakness. Where veterans found a new sense of mission, and refugees found a home away from home. James often reflected on the path that had brought him here. He realized that the greatest battles he had fought were not on foreign soil, but within himself, the struggle to forgive, to let go, to believe in the possibility of healing. He understood now that peace is not a destination, but a practice, a daily choice to show up, to listen, to extend a hand in kindness. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms bloomed in the garden, James welcomed a group of schoolchildren to the Peace Center. They listened wide-eyed as he told them about Amir, about the lessons he had learned, about the power of turning pain into purpose. He urged them to see the humanity in everyone they met, to choose understanding over judgment, to build bridges rather than walls. As the children scurried off to paint a new mural on the center's wall, James stood watching them, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. He thought of his younger self, unsure, burdened by guilt, searching for meaning. He wished he could tell that young man that healing was possible, that even the deepest wounds can be transformed into sources of strength. James's story reminds us that every act of violence, every loss, carries within it the seeds of transformation. That redemption is not reserved for the saints, but available to anyone willing to begin again. That peace is not a lofty abstraction, but a lived reality, one that we create, moment by moment, in the way we treat ourselves and one another. The Peace Center still stands, its walls adorned with murals painted by hands young and old, its rooms filled with the laughter and tears of a community determined to write a new story. And at its heart is the simple truth that James discovered on his journey, that even in the darkest times, hope can bloom. That by choosing compassion over fear, we become not just witnesses to peace, but its architects. As you listen to this story, perhaps you will remember your own moments of struggle, your own encounters with loss. Perhaps you will recall a time when you, too, felt adrift, unsure of how to move forward. Remember James. Remember that the path to healing is rarely straight, that it is marked by setbacks and doubts. But also remember that every step, no matter how small, matters. You, too, can be a builder of peace. You can choose to listen, to forgive, to reach out to someone who is hurting. You can transform your pain into purpose, your wounds into wisdom. The world needs your story, your courage, your willingness to believe that peace is possible. So let us honor the memory of those we have lost, not by clinging to sorrow, but by carrying their spirit forward. Let us build bridges where others would erect barriers. Let us choose hope, again and again, until it becomes the foundation of a new world. For James, for Amir, for all those who have dared to dream of peace, let us be the ones who keep that dream alive.